Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar titled The Great Reversal, Britain, China and the 400-Year Contest for Power. Just by way of introduction, I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at ZN. And my job today is to chair the session, moderate questions and keep us in line. And just looking at the program, the format is very simple. I'll have a very brief introduction and we'll get out of the way so that we can hear from Professor Kerry Brown, our keynote presenter today, and there'll be time for Q&A towards the end of the session. Now, if you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before and you want to make an observation or ask a question, the way to do that is to find the questions tab on the dashboard on your screen, type in your question, that'll come to us and we'll field those during the Q&A session. And you can put a question in at any point during the presentation. So if you have a thought that you want to get down, do type it in and make sure it's recorded. Talking of recording, we'll be recording the session today. So if you want to go back and look again, or you have friends or colleagues who might be interested in today's subject, the recording will be available up on our website and our YouTube channels in around 24 hours after the webinar finishes. The final bit of housekeeping is that if you do ask a question today, we will give your contact details to Kerry. So if there's a need for any follow-up correspondence after the event, that can be made easier. So it just leaves space now for me to introduce, first of all, our sponsors, just to say we are enormously grateful for our sponsors who allow us to run these webinar series and to bring people like Kerry to you, to our audience. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce Kerry Brown, who's been here before in terms of offering us his thoughts and his latest insights into China and China-UK relationships. Kerry, it's a great pleasure to meet you, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation this morning. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. This is about the Great Reversal, as I said, as Mike said at the beginning, Britain and China's history. It originated through looking at European history and our knowledge of China, a book that I did collecting the articles by really key intellectual figures from European mainstream development over the last 800 years. People like Leibniz, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Max Weber, Hegel, of course Marx, Bertrand Russell, and realizing that we had a long history of China, but it didn't really have a coherent narrative. And the European approach to China has largely been either to idealize China, to be very skeptical and demonize China, or to try and be more empirical. That was the position of Leibniz, for instance. So I thought, how was the sort of British kind of story of China when it's sort of set within that larger context? And this book, The Great Reversal, looks at four broad areas where largely in the last 400 years, Britain has had advantages with China, but I think that those have radically changed, particularly in the last 20 years. If we look at the economic, for instance, until 2005, Britain had a bigger economy than China. But today, the Chinese economy is 536% larger than Britain's. That is an incredible change. In terms of military, the Chinese Navy now is the largest in terms of vessels and vessel numbers in the world, although technologically it's still some way behind the United States. Of course, Britain is way behind China in terms of its military capacity. Geopolitical. Well, I mean, in the last 400 years, it's mostly Britain that has had the advantage in terms of its networks. Indeed, of course, because of its imperial possessions in the 19th and early 20th century, it was overwhelmingly a more network power, for good or bad, than China. But today, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the BRICS collection, with all sorts of other global south networks, most of them informal, China is way more networked in many ways than Britain, although Britain still has significance as a member of the UN Permanent 5 Security Council and other networks. So geopolitically, China is now considerably further afield than Britain, and that wasn't true until recent years. And the final, I suppose, more difficult to encapsulate intellectual and cultural, what we see is a China today which is producing some world-leading research on AI, life sciences, environmental sciences. It has a development and research budget of something like 320 billion sterling. I think the British collective budget, according to the Office of National Statistics, is about 16, 17 billion sterling. So, this is a great sort of disparity between the two. So these great asymmetries, I think, have shifted dramatically and quickly in China's favour in recent years. And I think that has really recontextualized and reshaped the relationship. What has been the policy over the last 400 years towards China? We've had obviously phases in that relationship, we'll talk about in a bit. But today I think we can say that our policy has been a sort of Goldilocks policy. We wanted a China which was not too strong, because it would prove a problem to deal with, but not too weak if it fell apart. We would want, in the Victorian period, when Britain had the most influence over China and literally ran its fiscal system, we definitely wanted a China which was not a burden to us in the way that Disraeli and Gladstone regarded the Indian sort of part of the empire, kind of really big fiscal drain. They didn't want that, but they didn't want a China that was too strong, that it then started to get assertive and encroach on British interests in China, which were mostly commercial. So that was, I think, the policy framework, and one wonders today whether it, in a sense, in a very different context, with those four asymmetries that I've talked about earlier, that there isn't a sort of similar kind of dynamic in our approach to China today. Phases. Britain knows China. It has had a relatively long history with China. That is why I wrote The Great Reversal, this book, because I thought it wasn't really a story that was told in a concise and succinct way in one place. And so I took a year's sabbatical from King's College London to produce this book, really showing how Britain's relations with China had developed, not just in the most well-known phases, in the Opium War period, the 19th century onwards, but before that, when we had contact right at the beginning. The first contact was around about the Elizabethan period, from the establishment of the English East India Company in 1600, and it was almost all about trade. Britain at that time, a little bit reflection of what's happening today, I suppose, had a more troublesome relationship with its European neighbours, and therefore felt that it needed to find a global kind of trading partnerships, and therefore with the East India Company and others, private traders, sought opportunities. In China, there were kind of sporadic setting up of particular posts, but China was not an easy place to do business. This was the era in which tea started to figure. The first time tea was really served in English coffee houses in London was 1650s, but tea soon became an absolute staple of the British diet, and that was why people wanted trading links with China. There was also the challenge of how to sell to China, and that's why the opium trade became important in the future, because it was pretty much the only thing that the British could sell into China that the Chinese would buy. But of course, it created enormous issues, moral and kind of otherwise, because of the addictions, the high levels of addiction that opium led to. Opium was grown in India and was not sent by the East India Company to China, but by private traders. They could do trade between different countries as long as it didn't come back to Europe. And therefore, the private traders were the ones that had most kind of skin in this game. The imbalances of this politically, because the British were not able to get access to the Chinese court in order to pursue their interests, meant a great deal of conflict. The Anglo-Chinese Wars, called Opium Wars in China, of the 1839-42 and then 1856-1860, set up a whole kind of architecture of British influence in China, from the treaty ports, of which Canton was the most famous, today's Guangdong, and eventually Shanghai was included in that, and also a kind of whole architecture of British involvement in the Chinese fiscal system through the Imperial Maritime Customs Authority, led by one man, who I'll say a bit about a little bit, This is a period of semi-colonization, not full colonization. Britain did not, as I said earlier, want responsibility for Chinese affairs, but a kind of informal system, enormously influential. From 1911, the third phase, until 1949, the Second World War, it's a more fragmented story. China split into spheres of influence with the Japanese, Russians, Italians, Germans, many others coming in. Sorry, and really a kind of decline of British influence. But still, by 1930, Britain was the largest investor in China, still had a huge amount of trade, and still through companies like Jardine, Swire and others had big interests there in building railways, processing sugar, all sorts of different interests. But it was a kind of declining story. The Sino-Japanese War smashed a lot of that kind of infrastructure apart. Britain's kind of privileges in China ended in 1943. And although Britain reacquired Hong Kong, ceded to it under various treaties in the 19th century for, kind of various periods of time, occupied by the Japanese from 1941 till 1945, although Britain kind of claimed Hong Kong, most of its other interests in China ended in 1949 with the takeover of the People's Republic of China by the Communist Party of China. The last British company with staff in China exited as late as 1959, but it was really a kind of period in which there was very limited engagement. However, throughout that period, 49 to 1997, Britain maintained representation in China. It wasn't upgraded to ambassadorial status till 1971, but there were always representatives, of whom one, Douglas Hurd, who was in Beijing from 1951 to 53, is remarkably still alive today. In 1997 onwards, this is the era we're in, really the handback of Hong Kong, after years of negotiations between Britain and China, kind of started a new period of engagement. So these are the 5 phases: trade to sort of more political, and then to a kind of gradual decline in British influence in China till today, where there's an attempt to really have a sort of balanced engagement, but often prey to all sorts of different headwinds. One of the things I talk about in the book is creating knowledge about China in Britain. One of my great heroes from writing this book is a man called Robert Morrison, shown here with his Chinese collaborators, a Protestant missionary who went to China. However, he was the first compiler of a kind of Chinese-British dictionary until 1816, 1817, when he did this incredible feat. British did not have an easy way to learn Chinese. The first recorded person kind of known to speak Chinese was a man called James Flint in the 1750s. But there were very few people who could communicate. That's why Pidgin English was kind of created. Long time no see, these sorts of phrases we still have today. Kind of same old. These are all from that kind of language. But it was obviously in a very imperfect way to try and do business, which was, kind of obviously more complicated. Robert Morrison therefore gave Britain the tools to understand China and the Chinese language, and the first chair in Chinese studies was set up in Britain at UCL in 1836. And I'm happy to say King's College in 1842 had the second one, and of course I have that chair today. So it's an extremely kind of important part of the British relationship that we did try and get to know China, understand China, in ways that the Chinese probably didn't reciprocate until way later. I said about the kind of involvement of British in Chinese affairs. Sir Robert Hart, who ran the Imperial Maritime Customs Service from 1863 till his death in 1911, was probably the most influential British person in China, although he was from Ulster, from Northern Ireland. He was kind of responsible for something like a third of imperial Chinese revenue, and so really had a massive influence on taking the tariffs from imports and exports and then giving them to the central government in a relatively kind of clean and uncorrupt way. Sir Robert Hart had enormous influence and actually a kind of really interesting understanding of himself as not just a British official but a Chinese official. And so in many ways he was as influential as the Chinese emperor at this time, and shows the high point of British involvement in Chinese affairs. in the 20th century, we have a kind of different sort of engagement with China and different kinds of knowledge about China. In many ways, we have a constellation of different actors. Joseph Needham represents, I suppose, the scholars who were trying to understand China on its own terms. He went to the Chongqing consulate in the Second World War, the British one, as a science and technology attaché, and discovered a whole kind of set of knowledge about China's early achievements in science, which were published in the massive 23-volume Science and Civilization in China. Joseph Needham wrote many things about the need for Europeans and British to be less arrogant, to understand that though the Enlightenment was an incredible kind of period and outlook in the world, that China also offered its own wisdom. Joseph Needham was a somewhat marginalised figure in Britain because of his political, somewhat sort of maverick opinions. But it's sort of probably the most important sinologist that Britain produced in the 20th century. He died in 1995 at the age of 95. The political relationship has always been a kind of difficult one. The only post-war British leader who really devoted time and attention to China was Edward Heath, who had originally been very hostile to the Chinese in the 1950s and 60s, but then when he became the Conservative Prime Minister in 1970, recognized China at ambassadorial level, and then visited China in 1974 as leader of the opposition. Here he is meeting Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong then was 81, suffering from Parkinson's disease. The report of that meeting I have in my book. It's an extraordinary kind of episode of a British leader meeting a Chinese leader and really kind of becoming overwhelmed by who this person was, what they represented. An incredible kind of encounter. And so Edward Heath probably is the only elite British figure until today who really has kind of tried to engage with China. He, when he left office, went to China something like 16 times. Many people were very critical of the way in which he was often very, very favourable to China during the Hong Kong negotiations. And, kind of even to this day, I suppose George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Golden Era was someone who's also very, very kind of positive about China. But Heath, I think, was the one who devoted most time to trying to understand Chinese culture and Chinese society. And I think that had a kind of big impact. The handback of Hong Kong was the moment when Britain and China really had to try and understand and work with each other. Here's a picture of Margaret Thatcher and the paramount leader then, Deng Xiaoping, finally finalising the deal about the handback of Hong Kong in 1997. The encounters between Thatcher, the so-called Iron Lady of Britain, and Deng Xiaoping, the Steel Man of China, were pretty incredible. The telegrams, which are now publicly available, show these two very different political figures kind of clashing with each other, but actually hammering out a pragmatic deal, which in the end did work. Although, of course, today Hong Kong's situation is very different to what it was in 1997 when the handover did happen. Thatcher disliked her visit to China in 1997 before she became Prime Minister 2 years later. She wrote that it was an unpleasant place ruled by unpleasant people. So she was not like Mr. Heath, but she came to have a grudging admiration, according to Percy Craddock, her advisor, with Deng, realizing that he was a significant and kind of really, really formidable negotiator. Over Mrs. Thatcher's shoulder, the guy right at the edge of the picture, William Erman, was the ambassador in Beijing in the 2000s, and someone I knew. So some of these figures who remember that period are still around. It had an enormous influence on the relationship till today. But today, what is the relationship? Well, it has been turbulent. In the last few years, we have gone sort of from a period in which, as we see here, the former Prime Minister David Cameron met with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping when he came on a state visit to Britain in 2015, marking what was called then the Golden Era. It was an attempt to reset the narrative in a way, that Britain had had a sort of turbulent time with China, and it had been kind of difficult. We'd always been having arguments about Hong Kong, human rights, Xinjiang. These issues, significant and important issues, had really kind of become more difficult to deal with. And it was an acknowledgement that the economic role of China in Britain was not really as it should have been, and so really an attempt to reset that. So Xi Jinping and Mr. Cameron's sort of talking in an Oxford pub. The pub was subsequently, I believe, I think, or the beer that they were drinking, the company was subsequently bought by a Chinese company, I believe, or there was some involvement in, the kind of the outcome of this photo. But I mean, the golden era was to end formally in 2023 when Mr. Cameron's successor, Rishi Sunak, the former British Prime Minister, said that the golden era was over. But even so, it's still a relationship that really, really matters hugely in Britain. I mean, one of the most tangible changes, I looked at the figure earlier of Robert Morrison, the first great kind of sinologist that Britain produced, probably the greatest that Britain's ever produced. So just finally, it's kind of a big, big circle we've come. In the early eras, it was really British going to China, British learning about China, British setting up institutions in the UK that tried to study Chinese. It was a kind of quite unbalanced relationship because it was more about the British learning about the Chinese. The first real mention of China by Chinese scholarship of Britain was quite late. I mean, there was an awareness of Europeans, but there was not an awareness of this place called England till quite late, and no real attempt to understand England in more detail until really the 20th century. And then, of course, UK and Britain and all the complexities of that, kind of came later. But what we see since about 2000 is an incredible revolution in which Chinese students and Chinese people, Chinese tourists, Chinese business people have come here, way more than British people have gone there. There are now 200,000 Chinese students in Britain. They're incredibly important as part of the British student community and the community generally. And that makes a kind of extraordinary kind of, change, representing the asymmetries that I talked about earlier when I talked about the kind of sources of potential imbalance between the relationship. That, therefore, is the kind of great reversal that I was talking about, the story of Britain's relations with China over the last 420 years. My conclusion would be that, this is not a relationship which we can say we don't know about each other. The British and Chinese definitely know a lot about each other. They just don't seem to remember it particularly well. So this book, The Great Reversal, is an attempt to really capture that for British people and to tell the story right from the beginning until today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Kerry, for that overview, I guess, of the historical links and the way in which we've tried to understand China and China has come to understand us to an extent. Some questions already in, but please, if you have questions or observations, please do keep them coming. So Dan Feeney just refers to the fact that Chinese people, on the whole, have sort of a lack of trust in other people and cultures, and don't seem to be as open to other cultures, or have a distrust rather of other cultures, and whether that is a disadvantage for China in terms of its global ambitions. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the the thing you could say is obviously that there's a strong sense, particularly today in Xi Jinping's China, of what is Chinese culture. People have a strong sense of their identity, and I suppose that's really what the question's alluding to. That there seems to be this very set idea of what it is to be Chinese, and you're either Chinese or you're not. So it can be kind of quite excluding. I mean, the British Chinese population has never been big, and it's an interesting part of this story. I mean, the Chinese community really originated at the end of the 19th century in ports because Chinese sailors basically were often, kind of coming here because of the amount of trade being sent. And they set up in Liverpool. I think the oldest Chinatown in Europe is in Liverpool, but then in London subsequently. Indeed, the Chinatown in London was originally in Limehouse. I went there a couple of years ago to look around. It's quite a kind of haunting place because there's nothing left of the old Chinatown. It's just the names of streets like Peking Street, Canton Street, and you can see the HSBC building on Canary Wharf, but you're really just in a bunch of kind of, very relatively modern houses that don't have anything to do with China at all, apart from the street names. Now, the Chinatown is in Gerrard Street. Britain has its first MP that was born in China, Yao Yang, who was elected at the last election for Labour. But on the whole, the 300,000 people of Chinese heritage in Britain have not had a sort of big political presence until recently. The Chinese students that I mentioned, I think, have had a kind of important role, and it's a question of what is their kind of function and what is their role in British society as bridges. I think what you can say is that never before have people from China kind of travelled abroad and been exposed to the outside world as much as they have in the last 10 years. So what the long-term impacts of that might be, it's hard to say. And also, there's been 5 million Chinese students go abroad to America, Australia, and elsewhere. That will also have a big impact, but it's too early to say what that impact might be. So I think the future is more complicated than the past, but we still don't know where exactly we're heading.
Thank you so much. Chris Davids asked what does your analysis of our relationship with China over 400 years tell us about how we should engage with them today, in particular with their current leadership? Chris actually refers to their current emperor.
Well, indeed. Well, we're used to dealing with emperors, and I have in the book a list of British officials who met the emperor, from George Macartney in 1793, the first significant embassy sent to China, not particularly successful in opening trade, but created a great deal of knowledge about China. So the Macartney embassy was incredibly important. But I mean, there were many, many other figures over the years, including Robert Hart, the man I talked about a bit earlier, who did meet the emperors. And of course, today you could argue that the Chinese senior leader, is a sort of imperial figure, has huge amounts of power. Our history teaches us that we certainly prioritize pragmatic links with China over more complicated things. I mean, that's what our history shows us, that overwhelmingly in the last 420 years, we have sought trading or commercial opportunities with China. We have tended not, as British, and I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing, it's just an empirical observation, we have tended not to prioritize values. Consular officials in the Victorian period, when Britain had the most influence in China and could have probably, brought about change. Consular officials, we had the biggest consular network of British officials in China in the Victorian period that we had in the world. The most were in this particular China consular service. Had very tense and sometimes antagonistic relations with British missionaries who were active in China from the 1870s. They felt that British missionaries coming to try and change Chinese worldviews, change Chinese religious values, was not going to be successful. It was pernicious and it created lots of tensions. And the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which was about kind of tensions between missionaries and local communities in China initially, kind of proved that. So for these consular officials, so Britain has tended not to talk a great deal about values when it really does stuff with China. That's changed in recent years, but it's in the context in which Britain has now, as I explained earlier, less levers to influence and affect change in China. So I think we have to recognize that our approach to China has mostly been very, very pragmatic. Today, there are particular things like environment or AI or kind of life sciences, global health, where we have things that we need to get from China. There are other things where we clearly don't see eye to eye. So that framework, I think, is not a new one. It's just one which is more in sharp relief these days because the differences are starker, but we've usually been pragmatic in our approaches to China.
Thank you very much indeed. John Adams has, first of all, commented, thank you for the excellent summary, but he's asked how should the UK or will the UK react to China and US's policy on Taiwan? Where does the UK sit with this?
Well, that's my new book, The Taiwan Story, House just now, came out two days ago. So, I mean, the One China policy set up in the 1970s with Kissinger and Nixon and Mao and Zhou Enlai was, a very complicated play with words about there only being one China and no one really overtly saying what they thought that China was, or just acknowledging the differences in position in Taipei and Beijing. It isn't an elegant, policy. However, it's preserved some level of peace until today. And when I say peace, I just mean lack of violence. I mean not the violence we see between Russia and Ukraine, or Israel and Gaza. I mean it's a tense situation. It's not a great situation, but China and Taiwan, as of today, have not come to real blows. Um, it is very difficult to know what the president-elect, Mr. Trump, will do from next January. He's very transactional. He might want Taiwan to do more on semiconductors, where 90% of the world's high-tech semiconductors originate from in Taiwan. I was at the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company in January during the election, and it's an incredible factory. I mean, if there was a bomb that went off over that, I mean, the world's supply chains of semiconductors would, for high-end semiconductors would effectively collapse. So Mr. Trump wants a sort of better deal from everyone. It's going to be quite destabilizing. For the People's Republic of China, it's pretty clear the red lines are any declaration of independence by Taiwan or acknowledgement of Taiwanese independence by America would be red lines, and it would definitely do things. That would not be a pleasant situation. That would in effect, the world's, the Third World War, because it's likely America would then get involved, and we would have, absolute kind of chaos. So my argument is that the one China policy is not great, but it's all we've got. We just have to stick with status quo because the situation today is unresolvable.
Thank you for that. And John Taylor's asked whether you have any insights as to why China supports Russia over Ukraine. Where does that sit in their worldview?
Yeah, I mean, I think Russia and China's relations is a complex one, but they have a huge shared border, and you can't really have a big argument with a country where you share such an enormously important border. I think it's about 4,000 kilometers or something. I mean, it's a massive border. I mean, Russia's influence in China historically has been quite significant. I mean, the Communist Party of China was very much funded and supported by the USSR in the 20s and 30s, and then became much more complicated. Stalin sometimes supported the nationalists, sometimes supported the communists. Mao Zedong, as he rose to dominant power in the 1930s and 40s, had a much more complicated relationship with the Russians because his version of communism was with Chinese characteristics, agrarian. It's interesting in the book, The Great Reversal, I do talk about British official understanding of the communists in the 1940s before they came to power. Unlike the Americans, we had tried through people like Michael Winstanley and others to sort of really have contact with the Chinese Communist Party. And the official view was that these were not Soviet stooges. They were, kind of a different sort of force and a more agrarian, peasant-led kind of communist outlook. So we always kind of knew that communism in China was going to be a different sort of thing to the way it was in Russia. And that proved subsequently to be right, because the Russians and Chinese had a big falling out in the late 1950s and really didn't have any major contact until 1989 again. So we can't say this relationship is always about harmony, but on the whole, it's one about getting on with each other. So Russia and China, I think China will try and support, has supported covertly. It's also supported Russia in terms of diplomatic support. But we have to remember this is a deeply asymmetrical relationship in which the Chinese economy is 6 to 7 times the size of the Russian economy. So this is not a relationship of equals. Will Russia continue to support, will China continue to support Russia with, kind of its war on Ukraine? I think that it won't want very big destabilization, and I think it will have its eye on reconstruction costs. I think it will support anything that tries to create what China calls a neither side wins, neither side loses outcome. Under Trump, that might be where we get. Very, very difficult for Europe to countenance that, but I think that China will probably support a kind of neutral outcome where both sides can say that they won, even though in fact both sides maybe up to a degree just ended up in stalemate.
Yeah. Thank you. I've got a couple of linked questions. Nikki Holzhausen's asking for your comment on current and potential future trade and geopolitical connections. And Clive Bullen really asking for your advice on how we might strengthen ongoing relations with China, particularly economically, but in other ways too. So, your
Mhm.
outlook and advice on how to strengthen relationships.
Yeah, I mean, so Britain now it's left or the UK now it's left the European Union. I mean, in a sense, we can try and aspire to having a free trade agreement with China, though it's extremely hard and unlikely in the short term. I mean, our aim was always to have more financial services and services sector, involved with Chinese. There's now a middle class of 500 million. I mean, they're a potential market. The common agreement on investment the Europeans signed with the Chinese but haven't ratified yet a few years ago would be the sort of model that we can aspire to. We have opportunities in China as it becomes a more service sector led economy. We just don't have easy routes to get to them. Um, so, I mean, that's one thing. Chinese investment in Britain is, I think, 2% of our stocks of investment from overseas. This could be better. I mean, there's always political issues, but I mean, there's certainly sectors in which we could have better, investment levels from China. Um, so, in that kind of about the economic issues. I mean, at the moment, the Chinese economy is going through significant headwinds. The property market is in the doldrums. Growth is 4.5%, 5% this year. It's still not bad, but it's kind of still not as good as maybe people want. Um, what can Britain do? I mean, I think that Britain needs a coherent narrative about what it wants from China, which is why I wrote the book, really, because we know this place. I mean, it's not like we're ignorant. It's just we forget a lot of things. I mean, we have a lot of experience from our past about how to work in China, how to deal with China, how to engage with. And so I think we need to kind of really reflect on that and be clear about the fact that there are things in the environment or AI and kind of um, general sort of economic development where we don't disagree, and then there are other areas where we really do disagree, and just have a balance. In the last few years, the British-China relationship has been very, very volatile, and I think it would be good for a few years now of balance and placidity, or not placidity, but just pragmatism, and trying to kind of just have some uh, kind of less stress on the relationship all the time, even though we still have significant differences. We just have to deal with those.
Thank you very much. Savannah Kiriakou has asked what happens when we bring India into the picture. It's already overtaking China demographically and trying to build its own alliances on the global stage. Um, is there potential for India to challenge China diplomatically and in terms of trade?
Well, up to a point. I mean, India is a significant power, and I mean, obviously under Modi, it's been quite nationalistic. I mean, I don't think. I mean, the Chinese economy is much, much bigger than the Indian economy, and I think China's relationships with India are quite competitive. They're two powers that, again, share a massive and in parts contested border, but they also, I mean, they kind of have, a non-aligned state status. India has very good, autonomous relations with Russia, and it's not like because it's a democracy, India is easier to deal with than China sometimes. I mean, they are both very distinctive places. The India-China relationship historically has never been easy, and I don't think that China regards India having the same kind of status as it. Um, I don't think in the future they're going to have an easy relationship because they are competitive. I mean, they're really competitors. And I think that it's strange that the world doesn't sort of do more about trying to understand the dynamics between China and India, because it's going to be really an important relationship in the future. And it's not going to be an easy one. And it's going to be one that, if it goes wrong, will have impacts geopolitically for the rest of the world. At the moment, we tend to just don't really kind of take much notice of it. But I think it's a really significant and really tricky relationship in the coming decades.
Thank you very much. We've got a few questions to get through in the last 5 minutes. First of all, Trevor Hunt asks, how far behind do you assess China is in their military technology? Their space technology we know is good. They've been talking about building their second stealth fighter jet. Do you have an idea of how that plays out?
Well, broadly, I mean, I don't think China is that far behind in many areas. I mean, nuclear submarines, yes, it's got big issues. The most advanced semiconductors, yeah, it's still gonna struggle, and is unlikely to catch up anytime soon. But in many areas, its advances in recent years have been staggering. I mean, really surprised the Americans and others. So we learned from this that we shouldn't be dismissive of the Chinese ability to kind of do, fast research and development. And as alluded to, I mean, in the avionics, they're definitely going faster than they have ever done before. You do when you're putting 420, or sorry, 320 billion sterling into your research and development budget, you tend to get results.
Thank you very much. Nikki Holthausen's gone back into the historical question, just asking why Britain got involved with the fiscal aspects of the Chinese economy in its early days. What was the driver for Britain to take those kind of steps?
In the very beginning, I mean, so why did Britain get involved? Why did Britain get involved? Yeah,
Mm, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, in the very beginning, because our markets in Europe and the Dutch and others were blocked because we were at war with them a lot of the time, but also because the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese were doing business the other side of the world, and the British thought, well, if they can do it and are getting good results from it, why don't we? And as a sea power, therefore, Britain did go there. It had big clashes with the Dutch in Batavia, Indonesia, today's Jakarta. I mean, big clashes elsewhere. But it carved out, a sphere of influence, particularly with India and through India, then with its interests in China. Initially, the biggest players in China were the Portuguese, who had the possessionship of Macau from the 16th century. The Italians, because of Jesuit missionaries. The British were not players, but they became players because of their trade interests. And their trade interests escalated when they had massive imbalances because of tea imported to Britain and needed to find something to supplement that. So they exported opium into China. That created the sort of imbalances around the Opium Wars in the 19th century. So it was trade and trade imbalances that caused the issue originally.
Thank you so much. Just quickly, Hercules Chu has asked, given the historical experience, how can we develop our current education sector towards the Chinese market without compromising concerns about national security or getting involved in other difficult aspects?
Yeah, I mean, so in Britain, we need more support just for learning Chinese language and having basic Chinese language, Chinese skills, knowing about China. There's two things that can happen. One is that we have vocational Chinese taught more widely. I mean, we don't need to do kind of complex degrees in Chinese literature and art. I mean, they should exist, but we need, kind of year-long diplomas and things like that don't exist to help people learn some level of Chinese, which is always helpful. I mean, for diplomatic and for business reasons, speaking Chinese is very helpful in China still. And the second, basically, is in our school system. It's easy to do Chinese to some degree up to GCSE. A level, it's completely impossible because the A level is really not fit for purpose. This is a long-term lobbying issue to get a better degree, A level. But at the moment, if you do Chinese beyond GCSE, you're going to have a really tough time because the A level is so difficult, and that's why so few go to university to do Chinese. The final statistic I'll leave you with, which is a sobering one, is that in 1999, when Britain had a bigger economy than China, we had 300 people doing Chinese language at British universities every year, graduating. Last year, when Britain is now, a fifth the size of the Chinese economy, we had 250
Mhm.
graduating. It's gone backwards. That is, bizarre. That is absolutely a catastrophe.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we have run out of time. There's a few questions we haven't got to. We will pass those on to you, Kerry, and
Yeah.
maybe invite you to just drop people short responses. But thank you so much for taking the time to answer the questions. Again, thanks to our sponsors. We are very grateful for their support in helping us bring knowledge content to you, such as we had this morning. Just looking ahead to next week, on Wednesday, a session, looking ahead till tomorrow, a session with Mauritius on digitalization of payment systems in Mauritius. On Friday, Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology. And Tuesday next week, the Employee Voice. So plenty of good content coming up. Just remains me to thank you for your attendance, for your engagement, for your questions, and to offer my particular thanks to Professor Kerry Brown for his insights and his time with us today. Thank you so much, Kerry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.